1 minute.
In the interim, I suppose I can tell jokes.
Yeah.
What is green and has wheels?
What?
Grass. I lied about the wheels. There you go. Okay. My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am the Assistant Director for Campus Outreach of the Thomistic Institute. The Thomistic Institute is a research institute of the Dominican House of Studies up in America. And we began about 11 years ago hosting academic conferences at the Dominican House of Studies and then a couple at off-site locations. And then about 4 years ago, we began a campus chapters program. So students at different universities can organize and can be constituted as a chapter of the Thomistic Institute. And then they can host speakers from a kind of menu or list of speakers who work with the Thomistic Institute, and then attend retreats and conferences. That first year, we started at about 4 campuses, and now we're at 46. So it's proven very fruitful for the students and for those with whom we've worked, and we feel very blessed to be a part of the work. It's my honor tonight to introduce Father Aquinas Gilbo. Father Aquinas hails from Lafayette, Louisiana. He entered seminary for the diocese and was ordained a priest of the diocese. He finished an STL at the Gregorian University, and then subsequently entered the Order of Preachers, doing his formation in the ordinary places that we do it. He was assigned as a priest in New York City at our parish of St. Vincent Fair, and then went on to complete a doctorate in sacred theology, writing on Charles de Connick's Primacy of the Common Good. He came back to DC a few years ago now to join our faculty as a professor of moral theology, and he also serves as the prior of our community there, the Dominican House of Studies. Tonight on Freedom Beyond Civility, providing the better answers to today's social questions, please join me in welcoming Father Aquinas Gilbo.
Thank you, Father Gregory, and thank all of you for coming this evening. I'm very grateful to the Catholic Information Center for the invitation to speak this evening. I've attended various talks here, but this is the first time I'm on this side of the podium speaking, and it is an honor. The Catholic Information Center, as you all know, is an institution here in Catholic DC, and so, again, it's an honor for me to be here, and thanks also to Father Gregory and Father Dominic Legg, working for the Thomistic Institute, for also helping to organize this evening. I'd be remiss if I didn't add, just by at least way of introduction, just marking the civic commemoration that we hold today, remembering the nearly 3,000 people who died 18 years ago today, on September 11th, those who died in New York and Pennsylvania. Here in Washington, we continue to pray for the repose of their souls and for the peace and consolation of those social questions. 50 years ago, when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, the Western world had entered only a few years into the sexual revolution. Its consequences were not yet certain. Although there were prophets in the 1960s who raised their voices in warning over what the sexual revolution would bring, Pope St. Paul VI was one of them, few foresaw the social and political problems that the revolution would create far into the future. Over 50 years later, we can review the revolution's history with some clarity. The results have not been good. Society continues to wrestle with confusion not only over sex, but also in consequence over the dignity of human life and the sanctity and permanence of marriage. The revolution's commodification and manipulation of sex on an industrial scale has led ineluctably to the commodification and manipulation of persons, resulting tragically in today's throwaway culture, condemned by Pope Francis. And that is not all. Weeds of the revolution continue to sprout. Recently, the nature of gender has emerged as yet another revolution-fueled source of confusion, unease, and uncertainty. According to its promoters, the popular displacement of sex for marriage was supposed to liberate man and woman, to enjoy each other with greater confidence and freedom. Instead, men and women today find themselves further alienated from each other than we can remember. Think of the Me Too principle of man and woman's unity and love. abortion, and divorce remain popular solutions to the problem of man and woman. And gender theory seeks to solve the problem at its root by deconstructing man and woman altogether. We're learning the hard way that adding the letter X to words, especially to pronouns, doesn't change reality. It only makes the pronouns unpronounceable and unintelligible. 50 years into the sexual revolution, we can trace the wild ride in which it has taken society, leading to much sorrow and tumult. Ironically, the liberation of our sexual powers has led to the eclipse of sexual difference. Those powers by which man and woman unite most intimately, and by which they reproduce themselves, now vex us to the point that for many of our contemporaries it seems plausible to deny altogether that men and women even exist. It's against this background of social sorrow and confusion that we should understand our current political moment. Today's lack of civility in the public square, the bad fruit of a growing political tribalism in society, has not developed in a vacuum. We've not simply lost our manners. We are wrestling socially and politically with questions that touch on the very nature, identity, and dignity of the human person. Man is either at home in nature, a creature of nature's God, or he is a blank canvas to be covered in self-expression. Our nation was founded according to the former conception of man. We are now experimenting with the latter conception. Which conception will prevail is not yet clear. What is clear that until this question is solved, the peace and tranquility that fosters civility will be in short supply. I wish that I had better news to report. Until the question of man is solved, or at least adequately, if not completely, we'll argue about how to maneuver in our current uncertainty. We'll argue particularly about the role of civility in our unsettled state. A good example of this is the debate that erupted in late May between Sohrab Ahmari, the op-ed editor of the New York Post, and David French, a senior writer at National Review. Both men are Christians, both find their home on the political right, but they disagree over the role of civility in our current political moment. On May 28th, David French published a brief article entitled, "Decency is no barrier to justice or the common good." In it, French highlights a lesson that he learned as a young lawyer. After a tough loss in court, his boss and mentor, a lawyer under whom French had worked on the case, called the opposing counsel to acknowledge, quote, their work, their sacrifice, and their victory. That gesture of magnanimity and civility left a deep impression on the young French. It became clear to him then that no legal loss is worth the cost of failing to recognize the humanity and goodwill of one's opponents. Transferring that lesson to today's political arena, fraught as it is with suspicion and acrimony, French wonders in his article, what do politeness, respect, and dignity cost anyone? Civility, French argues, is always an expense that we can afford. For French, there is no greater example of the practicality of this lesson than today's pro-life movement. He writes, quote, "The pro-life movement advanced through love for mother and child. And while no one should shrink from telling hard truths, the movement does not advance through scorn. Indeed, every hateful advocate for life sets the movement back. The violent and scornful men and women were the movement's greatest liability," he says. "When lives are at stake, you reach out to people with your whole heart." In light of what he sees as the inherent goodness and practicality of civility, especially as it has benefited the pro-life movement, French doesn't accept the ridicule of his critics, those who call him and those like him too polite or a squish. He doesn't agree with those who claim that he doesn't fight just because he insists on remaining civil in the cultural and political battle. In his article, French disagrees particularly with Sohrab Ahmari, who had recently tweeted, quote, "There is no polite David Frenchian third way around the cultural battle, the cultural civil war. The only way is through." French laments Ahmari's sentiment, not because it refers to him personally, but because it denigrates civility. Quote, "We live in a strange time when fighting for fundamental liberties while treating other human beings respectfully is seen as a sign of weakness." To the contrary, French argues in conclusion of his essay, "We must vindicate our core values without violating our core values. And I don't want to be part of any conservative movement that holds otherwise." It is possible that Ahmari did not intend to launch a public debate on civility, but he did. French responded to Ahmari in full. Now it was Ahmari's turn. In response to French, Ahmari argues that French's concern for civility and politeness overlooks the needs of the current political moment. Civility and politeness are wonderful, Ahmari allows, but not when the traditionally neutral spaces of civil society, in which politeness supplied a necessary common language, are no longer neutral or polite. Ahmari writes, "French believes that the institutions of a technocratic market society are neutral zones that should, in theory, accommodate both traditional Christianity and the libertine ways and paganized ideology of the other side. Even if the latter, that is, the libertine and the pagan, predominate in elite institutions," French figures, and at least the former, traditional Christians, should be granted spaces in which to practice and preach what they sincerely believe. Ahmari continues, "Well, it doesn't work out that way. And it hasn't been working out that way for a long time. As French well knows, since he has spent a considerable part of his career admirably and passionately advocating for Christians coercively squeezed out of the public square. In that time, we have won discrete victories, but the overall balance of force tilted inexorably against us. And I think that the Frenchian model bears some of the blame." To illustrate this point, Ahmari points to the growing popularity of drag queen reading hours in public libraries. Ahmari argues that the current maximization of individual liberty that we are now seeing in the culture, a maximization that he claims French supports and promotes, is bad for the family, bad for the church, and bad for tradition. It is the maximization of liberty, Ahmari contends, that chases civility and politeness from the public square. In American society, civility and politeness have been the protectors of traditional norms and behaviors. And so as traditional norms and behaviors are jettisoned by the culture, so too are their protectors, which is precisely what we are seeing today, Ahmari argues. Now that traditional norms and customs have given way, along with the civility and politeness that protected them, public life is coarsened, not only by new libertine customs, but also by charges of bias and bigotry lodged against traditional and religious communities. According to Ahmari, progressive individualism follows a certain logic. Its proponents make arguments like this: for us to feel fully autonomous, you must positively affirm our sexual choices, our transgression, our power to disfigure our natural bodies and redefine what it means to be human. Lest your disapprobation make us feel less than fully autonomous. This is strikingly similar to how Henri-Dominique Lacordaire articulated the arguments of French secularists in 1840. We must conquer you because we hate you. We shall not employ fire and sword against you, but by means of the law we shall put you out of the protection of the law. We shall represent your devotedness as a privilege dangerous to the state, to be gotten rid of by ostracism. You shall have no share of liberty, because your virtues have raised you beyond equality. Against this progressive and secularist logic, Amari warns, the traditional carve-outs for religious liberty will last only for a while. He writes, if the moral law is merely a matter of ancient, if sincere conviction, then of course it must give way to the demands for autonomy of people in the here and now. To bolster his argument, Amari quotes Archbishop Chaput, who recently observed, if traditional moral precepts are purely religious beliefs, then they can't be rationally defended. Because they're rationally indefensible, they should be treated as a form of prejudice. Thus, 2,000 years of moral truth and religious principle become, by sleight of hand, a species of bias. In the end, Amari's frustration with French is rooted in French's preferred solution to the problem of maximized autonomy, which is more autonomy. Amari argues instead that the political community, not just the family or the church, has its own good and its own legitimacy, and these should be fought for and defended against the demands of progressive and expressive individualism. The political on which a society stands is not neutral. It can never be neutral. For the political good, social health, and community flourishing are not neutral. Communities and the individuals that live in them are either growing or dying. For Amari, then, fighting for the political good requires just that, fighting. Civility good. Progressives understand that culture war means discrediting their opponents and weakening or destroying their institutions. Conservatives should approach the culture war with a similar realism. Civility and decency, orthodoxy, not pretend that they could ever be neutral. To recognize that enmity is real is its own kind of moral duty. In other words, why should traditional peoples be civil with those who wish to delegitimize their civic standing and drive them out of the civic space? Or, in the words of Lacordaire, who seek to ostracize traditional peoples and put them out of the protection of the law. The next day, May 30th, French responded to Amari in an extended essay entitled, What Sohrab Amari Gets Wrong. In it, French defends his appeal for civility. French begins by accusing Amari of building his critique of civility on two fictional characters. A fictional David French, weaker than in real life, and a fictional Donald Trump, more philosophically disciplined than in real life. To the first fictional character, French says that his real-life self is more combative than Amari admits. French defends his record of accomplishment. He points to his often contentious engagement with illiberalism in courtrooms and classrooms around the country. And in both realms, in lawsuits and in debates, French argues that persuasion wins the day. Not always, French admits. But he argues that persuasion works better than what he thinks Amari advocates, which French calls a punch-in-the-face populism. To the second fictional character, the philosophically disciplined Donald Trump, French rebuts Amari's claim that Trump seeks to govern consistently from a principled political philosophy, one that rejects autonomy above all and promotes instead order, continuity, and social cohesion. and which sees a role for government in a kind of self-defense to preserve order, continuity, and social cohesion. French finds Amari's claim about Trump laughable, though he doesn't explain why, except to assert that serial divorcers who bed porn stars are incapable of thinking such high thoughts. I'm not sure that history supports this claim, but Aristotle does say something to this effect. French summarizes Amari's view of the choice that confronts us. Quote, "In one corner is the nice milquetoast libertarian, David French. In the other corner is the strong instrument of social cohesion, Donald Trump." If this were in fact the choice we confront, French says that he too would side with Trump. But this is an accurate description of our current political moment, according to French. To his mind, nothing much has changed since the American founding. The political task before us, for the Christian conservative at least, is twofold: to pursue a zealous defense of the classical liberal order with a special emphasis on civil liberties, as well as a zealous advocacy of fundamentally Christian and Burkean conservative principles. In other words, our task is to defend the structure of the neutral public square, and in it we advocate through civility and persuasion for natural and revealed truth. Not only is this in keeping with the ideals of the American founding, French argues, but it is in keeping with scriptural admonitions to love your enemies, to bless those who persecute you, with full knowledge that, in the words of St. Paul, the Lord's servant must be kind to everyone, able to teach, and patiently endure evil. For French, these admonitions are not mere tactics to try until they fail. Rather, they are commands to God's people that do not admit of political exemptions. As a substitute to Amari's view of the choice that confronts us, French versus Trump, French proposes his own view. Quote, "We can forsake a commitment to liberty and launch the political version of the Battle of Verdun, seeking the ruin of our foes. Or we can recommit to our shared citizenship and preserve a space for all American voices, even as we compete against those voices in politics and in the marketplace of ideas." When the choice is set up this way, French is clear as to the side he takes. He defends the neutral public square, the centerpiece of the liberal order, where citizens are free to exercise their inalienable civil liberties. Amari and French left their debate there until last Thursday evening, when they shared a stage at Catholic University to talk through their disagreement. They'll continue the discussion this Friday at Notre Dame. As many have noted, Amari and French's conversation last Thursday did little to celebrate their differences, did little to settle. Did I say celebrate? To settle their differences. I think they celebrated their differences quite well. Did little to settle the public square. For French, civility is what is required when all voices are welcome and protected in public life, even when those voices are for influence. For Amari, however, the public square is never neutral. At every moment, it is aimed at virtue or vice, at human flourishing or human diminishment. For this reason, Amari argues, when the public square is bent on vice, French's civility at all costs gives cover to evil forces that should at least be resisted. More properly for Amari, these forces should be repudiated. In the hands of the vicious, the banner of civility does not protect the Christian. In the hands of the vicious, civility is unfurled to smother those who would fight for the good. When we look at the Amari-French debate, we see that both thinkers get something right. What Amari gets right is this: the public square is not neutral. Why? Because the human person is not neutral. He is, by virtue of his creation in the image and likeness of God, oriented to the good. He is not neutral to the good. To choose the good leads to happiness and flourishing. To choose evil leads to sorrow and diminishment. No person, and by extension, no social grouping, the family, the city, can be neutral to the good. States can choose to erect legal structures, leading citizens can choose not to erect legal structures, leading citizens to the good and diverting them from evil, as liberal states do. But the neutral spaces thus created are legal fictions. These spaces do not neutralize the human heart, and they cannot neutralize citizens or states to the real goods that perfect man and the real evils that harm him. Like persons, states must follow the first principle of practical reason: to do good and to avoid evil. Now, this is not to say that all neutrality in the public square is fictional. There is a way in which some government neutrality can serve the common good, and this is what I would like to add to Amari's argument. It is legitimate to wish government to remain neutral when dealing with comparable things, as the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment attempts to do in the realm of religion. The federal government remains neutral when comparing Catholics and Baptists and Anglicans and Presbyterians. It remains neutral even when comparing churches and synagogues and mosques. But this neutrality need not extend to the comparison of things that aren't comparable, like pencils and cigarettes, for example. Naturally and non-neutrally, the former we hand out in schools, while the latter we don't. So whereas the Establishment Clause remains viewpoint neutral regarding Catholics and Protestants, for example, does that neutrality extend also to Catholicism and Satanism? Are these two comparable, such that government cannot distinguish the two? Likewise, whereas viewpoint neutrality might allow for an Aristotle reading hour, a Nietzsche reading hour, a New Testament reading hour, and a Quran reading hour to be held in the same public library, does that neutrality extend also to drag queen reading hour? Is the latter reading hour comparable to the former reading hours, such that government cannot distinguish the latter from the former? To be sure, justice should remain blind, but her blindness should not render her ignorant or mute. What French gets right in the debate is this: civility remains of prime importance in civic life. The fellow citizen is by nature a friend. He should therefore be treated as a friend. The fellow citizen does not become an enemy until he takes direct and grave action against the common good. And even then, as Aquinas would say, mercy and clemency should shape the exercise of justice. When we put these 2 points together, Amari's point and French's point, we can develop a course of action in our unsettled time. That course of action is this: to promote the good vigorously in civic exchange. This is not just a defense of the good, a carving out of space for the good, but rather its real motion. The goal is to go on Amari's offensive, but with French's civility. An example of this, I believe, may be found in a newly published book, Mary Hirschfeld's Aquinas and the Market. I've never met Mary Hirschfeld, so I'm not, trying to gin up sales for her book, but it is good. People should read it. A trained economist and theologian, Hirschfeld takes on in this work the philosophical shortcomings of predominant economic thinking, especially that thinking born from what is called rational choice theory. This theory, Hirschfeld makes serious mistakes about the human person, truncating our appreciation of the breadth of human knowing and loving. Simplistic in its view of man, the theory contributes to simplistic views of man's economic activity. To correct this shortcoming in economic thinking, Hirschfeld does not raise the science of economics, slashing its errors and burning its idols. Rather, through engaging the concerns of rational choice theory, she demonstrates how Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy and anthropology and the economic ideas that we can draw from them do a better job of answering the concerns of rational choice theorists than their own theory. By examining essentially the social and political nature of man and the inherent connection between the market and the common good, as well as the perfection that prudence brings to human choice, Hirschfeld points the way to an understanding of economics that surpasses the reductive and individualist accounts standard today. It's important that in the Summa Theologiae, he begins with objections, then he examines true teaching, and finally he replies to the objections in the light of true teaching. In every question, Aquinas arrives at articulating the truth through examining opposing opinions. The objections that Aquinas raises at the beginning of each question are not straw men designed by Aquinas to bolster his argument. They are the real opinions, logically argued to by intelligent persons. Nor does Aquinas use the objections simply as foils for his already established opinion. Aquinas enters deeply into a consideration of these opinions, seeking to understand them from the inside. He draws out what is true in them, especially their concern for the good that they seek. But then in the course of presenting his own question, Aquinas demonstrates how his answer resolves the objectors' concerns better than their own answers. The result is a vigorous promotion of the truth, civilly presented as the better answer to deeply held concerns or worries. I would argue that this, my friends, is the current task of the Catholic in the public square. It is not to engage in the dance of liberal civility, nor to decimate perceived enemies wherever they appear. Rather, knowing the needs of nature and of the human heart from below, and knowing the saving truth of Jesus Christ from above, the task of the Catholic is always to present the better answers to the questions that press on our public life. In print, in speech, and even in the arts, ours is the task to speak the full truth of God and man, the full truth of man and woman, and the full truth of politics and economics. That truth that aims beyond civility, to engage reality, and to set people free. Thank you all for listening.
We have some time for some questions. If you have one, please raise your hand and I will bring the mic to you. The mic is on, so please hold it up to your mouth so our listeners at home can hear. Question?
No one else will. Good evening, Father. Thank
Good evening.
you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
I read National Review religiously. I
Mhm.
read your post for fun. I mean, who can beat page 6?
Right.
It's a great book. So I read both of the thinkers you quote.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot. And I've come to be an Amari guy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole National Review, David French, really the Buckley school of polite conservatism, polite Catholicism, has been driven from the square. It's very country club, I agree, it's very civil, it's very polite, and they dress well as people. But please address where the neutral public square still exists that's left for us to defend. We've been driven from the campuses, and aside from a few outlets, we've been driven from the media, certainly driven from Hollywood. I can't think of a public square we have anymore outside our parish church, and that is often endangered too, with the whole god of diversity that's been coming upon us. We've been hearing about the culture war for a long time. Can you give an idea why civility and politeness works? How it's worked for us so far? What real estate we've gained from it? And what we should do otherwise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one of the shortcomings of the conversation last week between Amari and French was this. I think that it avoided this question. For whatever reason, they didn't really get to discussing it. I think we heard a little bit of what David French would say. He'd say that that jurisprudence of the First Amendment has, in fact, within the last 30 years, created more space and granted more civil guarantees for believing Christians to claim and defend their rights in the public square. So, and he gives a long list of examples of defending college students and others who, for whatever reason, were discriminated against, on college campuses, and winning those cases and bolstering, at least at the federal level, the jurisprudence to protect those civil liberties. I think that can all be true, and I think this is what Sarab was trying to respond, that might work and be true on the political, kind of juridical level, but we don't see where that is evident on the cultural level, and so I would hope that in their conversation next week they would address this more clearly, because I'd like to hear what each one would have to say. So I do agree or sympathize certainly with Amari's claim that at the cultural level there needs to be more fighting that takes place, at least resistance. Now whether that means again decimating our enemies, or like I would suggest here, I mean, like Aquinas, it's to engage deeply and sincerely with the concerns of those who oppose us. That we do, to have the confidence that we do have and can provide the better answers to their questions and their concerns than they provide for themselves. So how that's done and the degree to which civility and politeness obtains there, I would say a lot. I would hope, but those aren't the only ways in which to resist and defend. Yeah.
Father, I'm surprised that the whole question is not centered on one point, which is the lack of civility can be assumed to be some kind of violence. And violence is justified in the case of, there's really a real threat to many of our lives. And combated with ideological arguments, but also legal and cultural means should be unrelenting. And one reason where you can see that is that the other side, the violence in the words, violence in the way they go to courts to get the crazy ideas and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it's preservation and recognize.
What you articulated, especially at the beginning of your question, does form part of Amari's argument. I mean, he does possess an understanding, as I said earlier, that the political common good is just that, a good. That civil society is something good, and something worth preserving and defending when offended or attacked. That those who have governance of the commonweal, should oppose the opponents of the commonweal, not just those that come from the outside, but those that also originate within, which then means that you have to have some kind of internal discussion as to what that good is, and from a consensus about that good to govern accordingly. So I think that's what Amari's argument ultimately is, which is why a judge should be able to make a distinction between things that aren't comparable, that fall outside of a kind of reasonable extension of neutrality that we would all kind of recognize. But then when the courts or government becomes or shows itself to be incapable of distinguishing things that are in fact distinct, well then, and just kind of turning a blind eye to all or remaining neutral to them all, I think that's where Amari sees that's where those who govern the commonweal fail to protect and preserve the commonweal, because there's already emerging the fissures of its own kind of stress and perhaps weakness and maybe ultimately destruction.
Yeah, Father, thank you very much. I love this presentation.
My pleasure.
I love Thomas Aquinas as a model for civility and civic discourse today. So, two quick questions. First, on Aquinas, can you think of anything in his corpus, in his Summa, where he actually discusses the issue of civility or civic friendship? If there's anything there that you can point us to.
Right.
And the second question is, how would you respond to someone who says, this sounds great, but maybe a little bit unrealistic? And
Right.
in politics, in particular, it's hard to be philosophical. It's hard to do the disputation model that Aquinas offers. So maybe in law, and maybe in seminar rooms, that works. But
Right.
in the context of politics,
Right.
maybe not.
Yeah, in answer to your first question, it's really the whole of the Secunda Secundae, the Secunda Pars of the Summa, the whole treatise on moral theology. You can read, as Aquinas' commentary, when he talks about the virtues, he's not just talking about our individual expression of virtue in pursuit of our own individual goods. He has other and even higher expressions of those virtues in mind, the domestic expression of those virtues and the political, civic expressions of those virtues. So he sees all of the moral virtues as having their own inherent kind of political expression, which leads to and promotes a kind of civic friendship, and that's deep rooted in Aquinas' anthropology of our being social and political animals. That the common good is our higher good, and that's integral just to creation and to our creation. The good of the family, the good of the city, and we're born into those. We inherit those, and just by our very existence, are participants and promoters, of those goods. So that virtue for Aquinas then is necessarily social and political. That we can never escape that. That's why he thinks that what he would see today is that kind of the modern individualist ideal or conception of the person is just absolutely fictional, and at the least is historically inaccurate. That the isolated individual simply does not exist in history. We can conceptualize such a being, but such a being in fact does not exist. So that's an answer to the first question. The second one, I recognize that, and even kind of putting this together, it seems, okay, we've got this big fight and we're ready to kind of push back in the public square, and what do you promote? Well, a book on economics, and, just be nice and, consider the other, the concerns of the other. I don't think that's exactly what I'm saying, but I think it is I think we've just gotten so used to public life and politics not including discussions of the good, that we can't imagine that actually taking place. That I'm not even sure we want politicians, doing this for us. That they just kind of talk about, and argue about policy and stay away from philosophy, anthropology. But I think for somebody like Aquinas, those two things aren't. You might be able to distinguish them, but can't separate them. That we should have politicians that, when engaged with policy discussions, step back a bit and say, okay, what is the good here, and what do we seek? And once we do that, then there are multiple means to that end that can emerge, and we can begin to debate and form political parties, around differences over preferred means. But we can't be divided and separated, over understanding of what the good is. And as long as we remain separate and divided over the good, we need, I think, real public discussion, on that topic to begin to have our politics begin to make sense again. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Father. I had a question about whether or not we can think about civility as a personal virtue for each of us and an asset.
Right.
I was surprised about Amari's turn to this more kind of progressive stance.
Right.
I was here when he spoke or you're speaking, and I read his memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he talked about in his journey back to the church was his roommate, who had this wonderful personal moral code that he followed, and how much of an impression it made on him while he was surrounded by shrill leftists. And that resonates with me, and I kind of see it as one of our key virtues, and I would just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, I don't think it's a question of civility or no civility. I think for Amari, it's a question of to apply it, to what extent and at what limit does civility cease to serve its purpose and some other, approach becomes necessary. So I don't think he's anti-civil, and I would think that would be a misreading of him, even if he might not articulate that quite well. Because I think if you push him on that, he would say those things. He doesn't say that they're not values, but he casts them as secondary values or concerns in the culture war. And I think he's just simply drawing, he does kind of take a military turn here, and so he's drawing an imagery from war. It's culture war, and from the battlefield that, the army doesn't win. That's ultimately concerned simply with, civility and good manners, that there's aggression, that's needed for victory on the battlefield. And that even kind of the rules of war, recognize that. So I don't know. I would just say that, I think what I tried to propose at the end is that civility, where David French is right, it remains of prime importance for civic life. And actually, Aquinas and others, demonstrate that. When dealing with real life and death issues, at least in conversation, these can still be addressed and handled with our opponents, with sympathy, and mercy, and also with a civility and a politeness that comes from a confidence that we already have the best answer. I may not be able to articulate it right now, but it's already there, potentially. And I have to work at getting at it. I have to study, I have to listen, I have to prepare, and think, converse with others, and do all of these things. It might take a long time for me, actually, to get to the right answer or to the better answer. But I think we have the luxury in those discussions of being polite and civil because of a confidence that we have in the truth. There was a Desert Father I read once, and I've lost this quote. I've looked for it everywhere. But he once said, and it's something to this effect, that if we find ourselves kind of stirred passionately by the proposal of some untruth, that's a sign that we don't possess the truth yet, Because if we possess the truth, and we're fully confident in the truth, we wouldn't be so bowled over by the proposal of error. And I think there's something to that, that our entrance into the public square should be, shaped by that confidence, which gives us the luxury of civility and politeness, because we're not bowled over by, or shouldn't be bowled over by the proposals of the other side, or threatened by them.
Thank you for your comments. I'm going to pull the discussion down a little bit.
Okay.
I
Sure.
am a high school teacher.
Okay.
I teach
Thank you.
actually moral theology.
Oh, great.
And And we're starting off the year, before we get into actual Catholic morality, we
Mhm.
are focusing on moral relativism.
Mm-hmm.
And in our discussions in class where we try to work out how in the world can you talk to a moral relativist, we've come up against the situation where we understand human nature
Mm-hmm.
and what it is and, you know, the limitations and the beauty of it. But the person we're speaking with doesn't have a clue about what we're talking about.
Mhm.
And so we're wrestling with how do you make that bridge, that dialogue?
Right.
How do you make it effective?
Right.
And draw that person to the truth. And I find that in the public square, we are so far from being able to have an effective dialogue because the concept of human nature is just, it isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And without understanding that, you can't understand why things are wrong.
Right.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question.
No, that's. I mean, I think that's a great observation, and you're on the front lines, you know, fighting this this battle against moral relativism. 2 points I would make. On the one hand, I think there's both a kind of ad intra and ad extra, you know, conversation we have to have. The ad intra is what we're doing now. I mean, it's having the philosophical and anthropological discussions in our own language, guided by, you know, our teachers, our masters, St. Thomas, and just honing our understanding of what's true and good. Coming to an understanding of and grasp of reality. You know, that's what we do. The ad extra, you know, to the outside. I mean, then, you know, that requires some translation. You know. And that's where I think the engagement with the other is really important. I mean, to hear how they speak, how they understand the world, what their concerns are, you know, and again, all the while listening, you know, to them and sympathetically entering into, you know, their perception and view of things, to already be generating how we would translate what we know to be true, you know, to speak to them. You know, Father Dominic Legg and I, you know, at the university where we studied together for our doctoral studies, was a philosopher there who one night over dinner, he teaches philosophy in a Swiss high school, you know, and just first of all, they teach philosophy in high school, you know, in the public school system in Switzerland, which is amazing. But he says that the hardest thing for him to do in teaching, you know, Swiss teenagers is to convince them that there is something that we can call the good, or some good, that exists outside of themselves, that it's not just made up, you know, it's not just what's useful to them, that regardless of a thing's use to someone, it has its own integrity and its own goodness apart from that. So I think that's right, and I think that's where a lot of our discussion has to be. I mean, we have to develop a kind of apologetic just for the good, you know, that this exists outside of the person and beyond just the limits of his own interest or use. And in fact, it's just the other way around. Things are useful because they are good, ultimately. And I think real discussion about the nature of the common good can be helpful here, too, because I think there's, within the tradition, adequate description of the common good, that once you get it, you see immediately that this is something definitely outside of myself and much bigger than myself, because this is much bigger than my own personal interest or personal good. And it is my good, but it's also not just mine. It belongs to another at the same time. And because of that, wow, I can begin to identify it as something that's not just mine that I make up, but something that's ours. And that actually shapes my life. So I think that could be the beginning, you know, of a kind of catechesis of the good that can begin to chip away at moral relativism. You know, getting the student to see that there are goods, and goods better and bigger than his own particular goods, that are real and exist outside of him. That's what I would say. One more.
Just building off what you're saying actually. My question was about the work that Thomistic Institute is doing with college students. Even before this
I might see the.
started, I heard my younger brother, who's a junior in college, I observed him wrestling with the tension between sort of almost like, I don't want to say arrogant, but a very like, I have the truth, let me tell you how it is, versus a more, not pacifist approach, but more maybe excessively humble. Have you seen other students engaging with this, and has your work helped inform their response?
Yeah, I would probably let either Father Dominic or Father Gregory answer that, but just a quick comment on what you said. I mean, for someone like Aquinas, I mean, the possession of the truth shouldn't lead to that kind of pride. I mean, that's a sin for Aquinas, you know, that building off the principle that the one to whom more is given, more is expected. I mean, the smart person, the intelligent person, the one who is in confident possession of the truth immediately becomes a servant of that truth, you know, to others. So the more intelligent he is, the more he should have a grasp on reality, but that all immediately puts him, because of his natural relation with others, in the position of a teacher, you know, who humbly, you know, and gratefully hands on what it is that he has. So I would say that passion is one sign that one might not possess the truth. Pride is another. That if our possession of the truth leads to pride, then we don't quite understand what it is that we think we understand, and that pride and living in the truth simply can't exist together. But as far as the TI and its effects on college students, I'll let one of you answer that. You can answer that. Yeah.
Well, I would just say one of the key things is that we found that there's tremendous interest on college campuses in some of the ideas that the Christian intellectual tradition has. And we want to present them in an intellectually responsible and appealing way so that it creates a real conversation, so that it becomes something that students discover that this is out there. But it is always a temptation to come in and possess the truth as a kind of a weapon. And that's not the ethos that we're trying to create. And actually, it's been, I mean, we have sort of intentionally stayed away from highly politicized topics for precisely that reason, because I think it doesn't get you that much. It gets you immediately into a fight. And actually, we're interested in asking a question that's one step behind that, with a deep conviction that when people start thinking with Aquinas, then a lot of this stuff is going to sort itself out, and they're going to be led in a good direction. And that's been our experience, actually.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, that's right.
Hi, for those who don't already know who I am, my name is Rosemary Eldridge. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications here at the CIC. I know we have some new faces in the crowd, so I just want to give a special welcome to you all. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm so happy you could join us. At the CIC, we strive to offer robust programming and access to the sacraments in order to feed the minds and the souls of those working in the DC area. We truly aim to make the Catholic Church alive and her teachings alive here in the hearts and minds of Washingtonians. Thank you, Father Aquinas, for your insightful commentary and being a part of tonight's event, Freedom Beyond Civility, providing the better answers to today's societal questions, which is part one of the Freedom in Christ series co-sponsored with the wonderful Thomistic Institute. More details on these remaining parts will be posted shortly, but I can tell you that in November, we have Fritz Schmidt joining us, and in December we welcome the president of the University of Dallas, Thomas Hibbs. So be sure to keep an eye on your emails and both of our websites. Our next event, Life, Religious Liberty, and the Survival of Catholic Healthcare, featuring Dr. Margaret Duane, Grace Marie Turner, Louis Brown, and Catherine Hadro, is tomorrow at 6 p.m. This event is co-sponsored with the Christ Medicus Foundation and aims to inform Catholics and people on goodwill on how best to evaluate healthcare policies, defend religious freedom, and ultimately protect Catholic healthcare. Finally, to stay up to date on all of our upcoming events, which there are many, the same for the Thomistic Institute, please visit our websites, join our listservs, and follow us on social media. Thank you again so much for coming. I know a few of you had questions still. I'm sure Father Aquinas will be more than welcome to answer them at our reception at 8 p.m. sharp. Thank you again so much.